Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on Joe Biden, moderate pragmatist or progressive trailblazer. Our speaker today is Thomas Gift. Thomas is an associate professor of political science at UCL. As founding director of UCL's Center on US Politics, he has written for influential scholarly outlets and is highly visible in the media, providing expert nonpartisan analysis on US politics. Thomas has made hundreds of TV, radio, and news appearances for top UK, US, and global venues. He's also held fellowships or visiting appointments at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Oxford, and the LSE. My name is Yara. I'm a PhD student in political science, and I will be chairing the lecture today. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during Thomas's talk by going to Slido. So you can just enter it on your internet browser and then enter the code #JoeBiden. I will now hand over to Thomas for his talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Yara. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to thank UCL Minds for the invitation to be here this afternoon and all the audience members for coming out for this talk. I know that you're all very busy and have many commitments and obligations, so it means a lot that you would take a little bit of time out of your busy schedules to hear this lecture. So as Yara said, the topic of my lecture today is Joe Biden, moderate pragmatist or progressive trailblazer. And the first thing that I would just say is the timing of this talk could not really have been better. I wish I could say that I planned it this way, but some of you may have turned on your televisions this morning or radios and heard that Joe Biden officially announced that he was going to be a candidate for the 2024 presidential election cycle. He did so via a video with the theme of "Let's finish the job." And so what I want to do today is essentially give an overview about Joe Biden's administration so far. I want to talk a little bit about what his current priorities and challenges are as president. And then I want to look ahead to 2024. Now that he's officially in the race, what does this mean? What are his prospects for a re-election? And kind of one of the main arguments that I want to make is that by and large, Joe Biden has been a progressive trailblazer to this point. Now with a evenly divided Congress, I think he has an opportunity to be a moderate pragmatist. And so we'll see whether he actually makes that transformation going forward. I will say at the outset, I'm going to focus primarily on domestic politics and policy. And that's partly just a function of I needed to, I think, sort of limit the scope of this talk, but also that's kind of my substantive interest and expertise. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. So what's Biden's record been so far? Well, the first thing to know, and I'm sure many of you are familiar, Joe Biden came into office promising to govern as a moderate. This was the key plank of his campaign in 2019 and 2020. And on his inauguration day in January of 2021, he essentially said, I'm here to unite the nation. I'm here to unite America. And of course, this was coming against the backdrop of January 6th and all the divisions and mayhem really that were stemming from the Trump administration. Joe Biden came in as promising to be a calming voice, one that was going to heal the country and unify the nation against the backdrop of very severe partisan polarization and divisions. So he came in not only saying that he was going to heal the country, but also promising to govern largely as a moderate, as a centrist. This has kind of been his record up until this point as a senator and also to a degree during his time as vice president under Barack Obama. So this is what he sold himself. I'm a moderate, I'm a pragmatist, I can get things done. And so you should elect me because I'm not going to take the country in sort of a far left or progressive direction. I really want to speak to the entire country. The situation, I do think, turned quite quickly and sort of changed the overall trajectory of Joe Biden's administration. And that was largely a function of a couple of key runoff victories that occurred in Georgia in January. So when Joe Biden was elected, it still looked like at that point that he was going to face a divided Congress. There were two seats that were up for grabs that were going to determine whether Democrats would maintain control both of the House as well as de facto control of the Senate. But at that point, most of the polls were kind of leaning in direction of the Republicans. And so it seemed quite unlikely that Democrats were going to get this. Well, that kind of turned out not to be the case. And in fact, two Democrats, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, won those seats. These were really key seats because they gave Democrats de facto control of the Senate. They already had the House. So Kamala Harris as vice president had tie-breaking power. And so all of a sudden, it looked like Joe Biden was going to be facing sort of divisions in Washington. And of course, with divisions in Washington comes gridlock. But instead, he found himself with total control of both the White House as well as the legislature. And this constituted a really large boon to the progressive agenda. So figures like AOC and Bernie Sanders and others on the left all of a sudden were ascendant, and all of a sudden they had a lot more power than they were expecting to have. And all of a sudden, Joe Biden needed to listen to them, I think, to a greater extent than he was maybe expecting, right? Because now Democrats had control of Congress. The expectations were simply higher, right? And there was a thought that now's the time to push forward fairly big progressive legislative items. And so more or less right off the bat, we saw, I think, a fairly significant pivot by Joe Biden, right? The same president who was promising to govern from the center as a moderate, as a centrist, all of a sudden came out with a very large set of spending bills. Right? And at first, of course, one of his sort of early budgets, he came out with $6 trillion essentially of federal spending, which is just a huge amount of money coming out of the federal government. Again, this was largely a functional byproduct of the fact that Democrats now all of a sudden controlled both chambers of Congress. So Joe Biden started sort of right away with a big spending package. Some of you may remember $1.9 trillion of COVID relief, right? And so this was not only a very large spending package, it was also one that Joe Biden himself and those close to him sold as being extremely progressive. So if you look at some of the quotes in the wake of this legislation, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki called this the most progressive piece of legislation in history. Chief of Staff Ron Klain said that this is the most progressive domestic legislation in a generation. Joe Biden himself said that Bernie Sanders said that this is the most progressive bill he's ever seen passed since he's been here. So one point to note is that a lot of the legislative items that Joe Biden passed early on in his administration, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the others, were passed through a special budget reconciliation process, which essentially did not require compromise from Republicans. There's certain types of budgetary bills that do not need support of both parties. Right. And so Joe Biden essentially passed this with 50% in the Senate plus a majority in the House. Next up was the $1 trillion Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of more commonly known as the infrastructure bill. This took a lot longer to pass because there was some holdups among moderates in the Senate, particularly Joe Manchin. But this was a major achievement. It was something also that Joe Biden had campaigned on, and that had eluded to a large extent Joe Biden's predecessors, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So the Inflation Reduction Act comprised huge investments in roads and bridges and transportation, green energy and climate initiatives. One thing that it has not done and really could not do, at least in the short term, is reduce inflation, despite its name. The hope is that over the longer term, some of the pressures could be deflationary, but in the short term, we've of course seen continued high inflation in the United States. On top of this, another progressive bill that Joe Biden signed was this was an executive order, not a bill, a student loan forgiveness plan. So this was $6 billion in student loan cancellation, which covered about 300 Americans, canceled up to $10,000 in student loan debt for Americans earning up to $125,000 a year. So we did see kind of a slew of relatively progressive legislation in the first couple of years in Joe Biden's tenure. Right now, the United States is engaged in a very large fight over the debt ceiling. So the U.S. federal debt now has reached $31.4 trillion. And essentially, the federal government places a cap or a ceiling on how high debt can actually get. We've reached that point in large part because of some of the big spending bills that Joe Biden has put forward. The Republicans currently have a plan to reduce spending down to the same level as 2022 and to curtail growth in domestic spending at about 1% per year over the next decade. Joe Biden has labeled this sort of an effort of basically a wacko notion that Republicans would try to curb spending. So essentially, kind of the point here is that Joe Biden has been, I think, quite progressive, right? And especially with control of both chambers before the midterm elections, used the opportunity to put forward what I think constitutes a fairly left-wing big government agenda. In addition to spending bills, Joe Biden did sign a number of executive orders. And so you can see here the particular executive orders and the areas that were covered: coronavirus, immigration, equity, economy, et cetera. A lot of this was just overturning executive orders that Donald Trump himself had signed. On the right here, you can see the number of early executive actions that Joe Biden took, right, and how he compares to some of his more recent predecessors, including Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush. So Joe Biden was quite aggressive in the use of executive orders. Now, despite the progressive agenda that Joe Biden has pushed during the first couple of years in office, there has been a limit to the extent to which he's been willing to try to appease those on his left. So there are a number of other initiatives that liberals have pushed for, including what's referred to as packing the Supreme Court, which would entail sort of an increase in the number of Supreme Court justices. Joe Biden, to an extent, entertained that notion, but really never gave it serious consideration. There have been some within the Democratic Party that have been calling for a killing of the filibuster. And essentially, killing of the filibuster would allow more bills to pass through the Senate, not require a supermajority, essentially, to pass through legislation. The filibuster is essentially a moderating force in Washington. Joe Biden has refused to go there. And of course, there's some progressives who have been on kind of the bandwagon of defunding the police, really not something that Joe Biden himself has embraced. Joe Biden certainly has been, much less divisive than his predecessor, Donald Trump. I mean, that's an understatement. But at the same time, I think a case can be made that his message hasn't entirely been one of healing and unity, at least to the extent that he promised when he came into office. Right? So he has used on various occasions language that I think could be construed as relatively inflammatory, kind of firebrand, and just generally hyperbole. So just as an example, when we're referring to some of the calls for tightening voting restrictions in Georgia and elsewhere throughout the country, Joe Biden labeled these efforts kind of Jim Crow 2.0, which I think is a huge hyperbole, and it seriously dilutes how bad Jim Crow laws were in the United States, which prevented Black Americans from voting and stripped them of many different other rights. I think to use that language in the current context is way overboard and extreme. In a fairly notorious speech now that he gave in Philadelphia a few months ago, he really attacked what he referred to as ultra MAGA Republicans. This is a term now that has been embraced by many on the far right, but he used it in a way that was, quite denigrating, not just to Donald Trump, but also I think to rank and file conservatives and Republicans. Joe Biden has also, in many instances, really leaned into identity politics that I think many centrist and moderates have not been especially enamored by, and that some on the right have kind of resented. So this is not necessarily, I think, emblematic of a president who is 100% committed to healing part of partisan divisiveness and political wounds. And as a result, and maybe this is probably too much for us to expect, Joe Biden really hasn't solved political polarization. And I think really he couldn't have. Right? The challenges that he was facing, especially in the wake of January 6th, probably too much for any president really to surmount. But if you read, any media outlet, what you will see by and large is that polarization that has afflicted the United States well before Joe Biden took office, and even before Donald Trump took office, really has not attenuated at all. And if anything, I think has become maybe even more extreme under Joe Biden. Again, probably not Joe Biden's fault, but it is the fact that he really hasn't been successful at reducing these divisions that are so deeply embedded now into American politics. And so you can look at this poll here done by Zogby, I think within the last year or so. Will the United States have another civil war? Percentage of Americans think that is likely, is almost 50% compared to 43% who think that is unlikely. Now, my own opinion is that the United States is not on the verge of a civil war. It's not anywhere close. But I think just seeing where the polls are on this topic are kind of emblematic and reflective of the extent of polarization that many Americans perceive exists and continues to persist under Joe Biden. So given all of this, what's happened to Joe Biden's approval ratings? Well, you can see here starting when Joe Biden took office as compared to where he is right now, his approval ratings have really hovered for the last several months around, the low 40s to low 40s in terms of the approval rating. So not exactly where he wants to be. We're going to come back to some polling toward the ends. So despite all this, Joe Biden has had, I think, a decent number of wins. We talked about some of his legislative victories. We talked about some of his executive orders that he has put forward. In many respects, I think it's remarkable what he has been able to accomplish given partisan polarization that we see across the United States, but in Washington in particular. It's certainly been not been easy. Most of the legislation that he has been able to achieve so far has been diluted significantly through compromise, but he has achieved a lot. I mean, just the infrastructure bill in and of itself was a significant accomplishment, as I mentioned before, that eluded his last two predecessors. So despite this significant number of political wins and legislative wins, why is Joe Biden so unpopular? I think we can kind of think about this in two respects. One is factors that are outside of his control, and one is factors that are within his control. Those factors that are outside control are just that, look, we have secular trends in demographic and partisan sorting Democrats have largely become the party of well-to-do, educated suburban and urban voters. Republicans, by and large, have become the party of rural voters. Polarization is just so deeply embedded in American politics. The battle lines are just so clearly drawn that maybe we can't expect a president now to go much above 40 percentage points. We saw the same thing was true with Donald Trump before that. And so maybe this is essentially just the new normal. And so to say, well, Joe Biden is underwater, he's under 50% in terms of his favorabilities, it's maybe hard to imagine a president going forward, given the current political climate, going much higher than that. So there could just be kind of a natural ceiling now on where presidents can be in terms of their approval ratings. At the same time, I think that there are some factors that are within the control of Joe Biden, and maybe where he has missed somewhat of an opportunity. I think Democrats, by and large, have maybe not deliberately, but they've sort of abandoned the working class, right? Middle America. Most states that have been gutted by globalization have experienced deindustrialization and so on. Democrats, I think, just are not talking to these voters, or at least not talking to them in a way that they find particularly appealing. And I do think that there's something to be said for the fact that many Republican voters, those who have embraced particularly a more populist orientation, feel like they're being patronized, feel like they're being talked down to, feel like they're being ignored by the current iteration of the Democratic Party. And so to the extent that Joe Biden encompasses that feeling, he's not been able to bridge some of these divisions that he would have hoped coming in. Democrats, I think, have made a mistake to an extent of really focusing on policies and saying to middle income voters or working class voters, here are all the policies that are helping you. It's more on the cultural side, the culture wars, where Democrats are increasingly seen as out of touch relative to where a lot of Republican voters currently are. And so as a result, kind of no amount of policies, no amount of redistribution, no amount of sort of making the case that our legislative items are going to be more effective for your life will make a difference if Republican voters continue to think that a good portion of the Democratic Party is talking down to them or patronizing them. Nevertheless, despite Joe Biden's low approval ratings and despite some of the challenges that I just mentioned, Democrats did do much better than expected in the 2022 midterms. And so I'm sure many of you were following this. There was no red wave, so to speak, that was expected. Going into November of 2022, we're hearing lots of predictions from experts and pundits that Democrats were just going to have a huge loss here because of Joe Biden's low popularity, because of inflation, because of a surge of immigration at the US-Mexico border, because of Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. All of the trend lines seem to be pointing against Democrats. And yet we didn't see this red wave. Instead, we saw more of a red trickle. Republicans took the House of Representatives, but only by a very thin margin. Democrats were able to actually maintain the Senate. I do think that this victory, to the extent that we can call it a victory for Joe Biden and the Democrats, was more a function of voters not liking what they saw from Republican candidates rather than it was a ringing endorsement of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. So most of the candidates that lost were Trump-endorsed candidates. It was certainly a very bad night for him. Those who endorsed, for example, January 6th, those who kind of spread conspiracy theories, those who embraced far-right policies, they did not do very well during the midterms. And I think that candidate quality and what Republican candidates kind of represented in 2022 was more responsible for their losses than anything that Joe Biden did. Of course, abortion was also a very big issue This came in the wake of the Dobbs decision, which essentially took the abortion issue and sent it down to the states. It even surprised me, I think, the extent to which this really galvanized a significant portion, not only of Democrats, but also moderates as well. And so at the end of the day, Democrats got sort of a big lift coming out of the midterms. It's especially notable because typically in off-year election cycles where a president is in office, the opposing party tends to do well. That was not the case here. Okay, so what are some of the current priorities and challenges that Joe Biden is facing right now? Well, even despite doing better than expected in the midterms, kind of problems abound for Joe Biden. So he's now embroiled in an investigation by the Justice Department over the mishandling of classified documents. Of course, remember the raid at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's estate, where he had taken documents and refused to comply with requests from the FBI and the Department of Justice to hand those documents over. Seemed like a big scandal. A few months later, essentially saw the exact same thing with Joe Biden. There wasn't the obstructionism, right? And there probably wasn't necessarily even knowledge that these documents were out of place, but the politics of it are close enough that it has allowed Republicans to muddy the waters, and it's been an embarrassment to Joe Biden. And so this is something that he is currently facing. Joe Biden is also facing a big surge at the U.S.-Mexico border in terms of undocumented immigration. This has become a huge problem and a rallying cry on the right, particularly among constituents in many border states. So this is a big political problem for Joe Biden. Inflation continues to be the big weight around the neck of the Biden administration. It is curtailed to an extent, but it is still significantly higher than the 2 to 3 percentage points that the Federal Reserve would be targeting. It is notable, I think, that inflation in the United States, at least recently, has been somewhat lower, actually, than the numbers that we've seen in the UK and Europe. Still, I think a case can be made that some of his big legislative items, including the COVID relief bill, have been quite inflationary, right? And so have contributed to this problem. I think this is particularly a problem for Joe Biden because he initially said that inflation was going to be fleeting, it was going to be short-term, it was going to not be very long-lived. That certainly turned out not to be the case, and it's still going to be a big obstacle for him heading into 2024. Of course, we have the Hunter Biden laptop story. This is kind of the gift that keeps on giving for Republicans. And so, whether you think that this is a legitimate probe or not, it's something that continues to remain in the news. And I think it is a political problem for Joe Biden. I think that there are legitimate questions that need to be answered with respect to it. So essentially, Joe Biden's facing a lot of political and legal troubles heading into the last 2 years of his term. Divided government as well. So even though Democrats did do better than expected in the midterms, of course, Republicans still maintain the House of Representatives. And by virtue of the fact that they control the House of Representatives, they can launch sort of an infinite number of probes and investigations. They can, stymie the legislative agenda of Joe Biden and really ensure gridlock. And that's by and large what we have seen since the midterms. What does that mean for Joe Biden? It means any kind of big, bold, progressive hopes that he has are largely dead on arrival. So we're not going to see another infrastructure bill. We're not going to see another, bill on the order of the COVID relief package, et cetera, et cetera. So Biden right now, I think, is focused largely on what's kind of a less glitzy task of implementation of some of these bills that have already been passed. That challenge is made more difficult by the fact that a number of key staff members have left the administration, including kind of the chief of staff, Ron Klain. There might be some areas for compromise with Republicans in the next year and a half or so, but very unlikely. I don't think we're going to see anything substantial. Just to come back to this issue of the debt ceiling, I think it will be a major issue that you'll be seeing in the news. $31.4 trillion in debt. The fact that, if this debt ceiling isn't raised, it would lead to the default of the federal government on all of its loans. It's a big issue, right? House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is essentially trying to use this as an opportunity to strong-arm Democrats into making concessions on spending. Right? So essentially, he wants to force Joe Biden to come to the negotiation table and to say, look, if you want an increase in the debt ceiling, you're going to have to make some sacrifices on the spending side. So far, Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans have tried to signal that they're not interested in rolling back Social Security and Medicare, which have become kind of third rails in American politics. But they do want to see decreases in other types of domestic discretionary spending, including various entitlement programs. They want to see some rollbacks of funds that were devoted to COVID relief. They want to see less spending on climate, clean energy, these kinds of things. So whether or not that will be successful, I think will be a real test for Joe Biden in the short to medium term, and I think will be indicative of what his strength is at the moment. Okay, lastly, before we go into the Q&A, I just want to talk a little bit about the path ahead in 2024. So now that we know Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are all in for 2024, what does this mean and what can we expect? Well, the first thing to say, of course, is Joe Biden is probably main Achilles heel is his age. He's currently 80 years old. A second term, if he completed it, would take him all the way up to 86. And there are some real questions about his mental and physical acuity. I do not think that is just a right-wing talking point. It used to be almost off the table talking about Joe Biden's, mental and physical vigor, but really that's not the case anymore. In fact, we just saw a pretty explicit New York Times editorial raising some of these questions to say that they are legitimate. This is something that voters are going to take into account, and all the polls suggest that this is a big concern for voters, including Democrats. I think many are not thrilled that Joe Biden decided to run again. Many predicted that he was not, that he was going to bow out gracefully and say, I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. It's now time for handing the baton over to someone in the next generation. That hasn't happened, and we can discuss why. I think one of the key reasons why is that there is not a very deep bench of apparent successors on the Democratic side. So there's no one obvious that would have kind of taken the mantle from Joe Biden. You might have said a few years ago that Kamala Harris was kind of the natural heir apparent, but certainly that's not the case now. I think she's really failed to impress across the partisan aisles. She's been given a relatively low profile. Her poll numbers are even lower than Joe Biden, and so I just don't think that she would be kind of a natural successor to him. And I think the last thing that Democrats really wanted and Joe Biden wanted was another messy primary debate. So this kind of solidifies him. Story's clear now that Joe Biden's going to be running. Everyone can get behind him, and that's going to be the narrative for Democrats heading into 2024. But Biden's numbers do not look very good. I mean, I think that is putting it mildly. 32% of Americans, according to a recent CNN poll, say that he deserves re-election. 67% think that he doesn't have the stamina and sharpness to serve effectively as president. 65% think that he doesn't inspire confidence. 54% think that he's not honest and trustworthy, and 54% do not think that Joe Biden cares about people like them. These are not very good numbers, right? There's really no way to spin it, and a number of journalists have raised some of these points with Joe Biden, and he's kind of dismissed them as expected. said, just watch me run, and my supporters will fall in line. But it's hard to look at this poll, which just came out this month by CNN, and to say that it's going to be an easy path or a straightforward path for victory for Joe Biden. At the same time, we've also seen, against this backdrop of, I think, fairly progressive spending, a decline in the trust in government under Biden, which is notable. So before Biden was elected, the percentage of Americans who thought that the government should do more was about 54%. More recently, the number that think that government is doing too much is over half. So, not a huge difference, but I do think that it is reflective to an extent of the fact that maybe a sizable percentage of Americans are coming around to this conclusion that they don't necessarily want as big of a government as Joe Biden has been pressing so far. At the same time, it's hard to talk about Joe Biden without talking about his most likely challenger in 2024, and that is Donald Trump. At this point, I don't think that there is any doubt that Donald Trump is the prohibitive favorite to win the Republican nomination, and that this is most likely who Joe Biden is going to be facing in the general election. There are a few reasons for this. One is Trump really never lost his grip on the quote unquote MAGAverse. Just heard expert after expert, pundit after pundit, making the prediction that Donald Trump was meeting his political demise, right? We heard that after impeachment 1.0, we heard that after impeachment 2.0, we heard that as a result of January 6th, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every single time we hear from the experts that, this is the last straw for Donald Trump, it never is. And so I've kind of been pushing this for quite some time, and that is Donald Trump has a huge stranglehold over the Republican Party. It's almost impossible to overestimate, right? And he never lost that grip. Some of his poll numbers dipped a bit, and they've ebbed and flowed, but he still maintains a very strong floor of support within the Republican Party. Some of the legal troubles that he has been embroiled in, particularly his indictment in New York City, which I'm sure many followed in the news, it's actually helped him relative to his potential competitors in the Republican primary field. So he's seen a huge boost. It's allowed him to fundraise. He channeled something like $7 million off of the New York indictment. So this has just been kind of an unequivocal good for him. The other thing to keep in mind with Republican primaries is that it's not just Donald Trump versus Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, or it's not just Donald Trump versus former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. It's not one-on-one. It's really Trump versus everyone else. And if you think about how the Republican primaries operate, right, especially given that there are a lot of winner-take-all states, it's entirely possible, and in fact, I think likely, that what you will see is that Donald Trump will maintain his floor of support within the Republican Party, which is about 30 to 40% of voters. All of the other candidates will split the anti-Trump vote, and that will allow Donald Trump to essentially run the table. So if you look at, for example, polls one-on-one between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, they look somewhat competitive, although even there, it's become less so. A couple months ago, Ron DeSantis had a slight edge. Now Donald Trump, according to the most recent polls that I've seen, has about a 15% margin there. Those are misleading, though, right? Because it's not just Donald Trump versus DeSantis, or not Donald Trump versus another candidate. It's really Donald Trump versus the rest of the field. The fact that Donald Trump has this floor of support means that he has kind of a natural advantage, especially in some of these early winner-take-all primary states. Also, it's not just rank and file voters that are falling in line behind Donald Trump. It's really those in Congress, other thought leaders within the Republican Party, and so on. Some of you may have seen at the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is this big conservative conference, a year or two ago, supporters rolled out a gold statue of Donald Trump, which in large part, I think, is emblematic of the really strong support that he has. Representative Matt Gaetz has said, we're not really a wing of the Republican Party, we're the whole body, we're the main attraction and the greatest show on earth, that in description of Trumpism. Senator Ted Cruz, who in 2016 was a competitor of Donald Trump, said recently, let me tell you this right now, Donald J. Trump ain't going anywhere. And I think that that's absolutely true. And so this has clear implications for Joe Biden. You know, some think that you can have Trumpism without Trump, but I think kind of the best description of this came from comedian Bill Maher, which is, you know, why would Republicans want a tribute band when the actual band is still playing? So why would they want a candidate like Ron DeSantis, who embraces many of the Trumpist impulses, when you could just have Donald Trump himself? And I think that there's a lot of truth to that statement, right? And it is reflective of the fact that Donald Trump still maintains a huge amount of support within the party. So I think a Trump resurgence vis-a-vis Biden, that possibility is relatively good. And you can see some of the headlines here that are indicative of that fact. And so if we're looking ahead for a rematch of 2024, it may just be, who do Americans dislike least? Now, if you look at the polls, it's certainly the case that a majority of voters do not want to see a Donald Trump versus Joe Biden rematch. And yet the irony here is that's almost certainly the outcome that we're going to get. 70% of Americans don't want Joe Biden to run again, according to a recent NBC News poll. 60% don't want Donald Trump to run again. And yet these are the candidates that we're almost going to certainly get. So if we look at the electoral math, who is actually likely to win in 2024 if that matchup does hold? I still think you have to give the edge to Joe Biden, but I think it's going to be reasonably close. So here's the Electoral College map from 2020, shows Joe Biden's victory. And of course, really the election comes down to a few key states. So we all know that America's presidential contest isn't determined by the popular vote, but instead it's determined by the Electoral College. And what Joe Biden was able to do that Hillary Clinton was not able to do in 2016 was tip some of these key swing states. So the fact that Joe Biden was able to win in Arizona, he was able to win in Pennsylvania, he was able to win in Georgia. This was hugely important for his victory. And if you look at some of the polling in those states, I think that they are quite encouraging, at least at this point, for Joe Biden, especially if you go back to the 2022 midterms and think that they're a harbinger for 2024. But again, a lot can happen between now and the election. Lots of X factors, lots of unpredictabilities, unclear where the economy is going to head. And so I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that just because Joe Biden won in 2020 against Donald Trump, that he necessarily will do so again. So with that, I think I will wrap up, and very happy to take some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Thomas, for a really insightful and thought-provoking discussion. We will now move on to the Q&A section, and I will read out some questions to you. So you mentioned that many of President Biden's executive orders were aimed at sort of reversing or overturning policies implemented by the Trump administration. So to what extent do you think that Biden's presidency represents a necessary corrective to the conservative populist movement that was largely driven by Trump? Or does Biden just represent a temporary pause in its momentum?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Yar. I think the answer to that largely depends on your own politics and where you would like to see America go as a country. As I mentioned before, I really think that Joe Biden has governed more as a progressive trailblazer than a moderate pragmatist. I do think that that's not where a majority of Americans actually are. There's a saying, to use a sports analogy, American football, that American politics is played between the 40-yard lines, which basically means that it's played within the center. And if you look at polls on key issues, right, on abortion, on the environment, on the economy, on education, on healthcare, most Americans actually express relatively moderate positions, and to an extent quite nuanced positions, despite this narrative that we hear about kind of excessive polarization in the United States. Polarization is certainly a real thing, but it is more pronounced among political class and elites. And so I think that Joe Biden has been, tugged quite hard by the progressive faction within his party, maybe to an extent tugged harder than he was necessarily comfortable with, but ultimately he's president and has an opportunity to push back. But it didn't, the politics for Joe Biden were quite tricky at the outset, because as I mentioned, the fact that Democrats held both the Senate as well as the House in his first 2 years in office just raised expectations really high, and it gave significant kind of wind behind the sails of progressives to say, look, this is our time. This is an opportunity to really push some of these bold progressive items that we want to see done. And I think to a large extent, Joe Biden was captive to that.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Thomas. There's another question that's kind of popular now, I know. Do you think that Joe Biden's spending and potential debt ceiling increase is responsible for de-dollarizing the US from trade amongst India, Brazil, and China, and so on?
So I'm going to punt on that question. It's just a little bit beyond my pay grade there.
Okay, so you also discussed the trajectory of Biden's approval ratings in the past 2 years and pointed to a range of factors that are outside of the president's control. So what conclusions can we draw from the fact that the trajectory of Biden's approval ratings so far really closely mirror that of Donald Trump? I mean, does this perhaps speak to the impossibility of the job rather than the importance of individual performance?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. Most presidents, of course, have a honeymoon at the beginning of their presidency. So the first 100 days, there's a lot more deference. They tend to come in with, higher popularity ratings. They've just won an election. They've been in the news. They've had their inauguration. And then kind of reality sets in, and partisan division sets in, and kind of all that Washington represents sets in. And it makes it very difficult, I think, for presidents to maintain extremely high approval ratings. We can go back, for example, to Bill Clinton. At one point after his impeachment, he had an approval rating of upwards of 70%. I just can't imagine any president now in the current hyper partisan and polarized climate ever getting anywhere near that kind of number. And so you might think that maybe 50% is almost the ceiling at which presidents are able to achieve now in terms of their popularity. But going much higher than that is difficult because the country is just so polarized. I mean, some Americans, no matter what Joe Biden does, no matter what another president does, just will not support a president of the opposing party. And so I do think that, in large part, this 40 to 45% range that Joe Biden has been operating in, it's maybe not realistic to expect to achieve numbers that are much higher than that.
Okay, thank you. So another question is, what do you think about the talk of a Tucker Carlson political bid? Now he's out at Fox, Trump Carlson, 2024 ticket on the table.
I think that's certainly an interesting prospect. I actually think a more likely scenario is that Tucker Carlson runs for president himself. I don't think that is entirely implausible. It's not something that we can discount. The relationship between Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson is a little bit complicated. Certainly, Tucker Carlson on air has been one of Donald Trump's biggest boosters, and he's trafficked in many of these conspiracy theories, and he's defended elements of January 6th and so on. But in private, and this came out in the Dominion voting case, he's been very critical of Donald Trump, and essentially said in a private text message that he hated Donald Trump passionately. So that bridge may be difficult to build, thinking about a potential Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson ticket. But yeah, Tucker Carlson is a tremendously influential figure within the right wing of the Republican Party. Even though he's lost his job at Fox News, he's going to land somewhere. And so his voice is going to continue to resonate and be very influential. And yeah, maybe he actually does throw his hat in the ring. It's probably premature to make any predictions there, but it's certainly something interesting to speculate about.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So since we're on Trump, this is more of a general sort of question. How has President Biden contributed to the stabilization of American politics, and how does this compare to the volatility that we experienced during Trump's presidency?
Well, I think to an extent, Joe Biden has certainly brought a degree of normalcy back to Washington. That is something that he promised, and I think he has achieved that, right? And so Donald Trump, though, was just such an outlier on this front that almost anyone that would have succeeded him would seem relatively normal. I think Joe Biden, by and large, has been a calming president, but the damage that was done by Trump's presidency throughout his 4 years is kind of blow up the system approach, his anti-establishment approach, his sort of I'm going to shatter all executive norms approach that really did significant damage to American democracy. And so to the extent that Joe Biden has been able to serve as a pacifying influence, I think that's positive. At the same time, as I did mention, I think that there have been times and instances where Joe Biden has kind of failed to live up to his billing as this centrist who's going to heal partisan divisions. I really do think that some of the language that he used surrounding, voting rights legislation that Republicans were passing, even if you disagree with that, was just completely over the top. And I'm not sure exactly what advisors he was listening to that thought that this was a good idea, but that was kind of inflammatory in its own right. Again, not to draw an equivalency with Donald Trump because he was sort of in a camp all of his own, but there have been places where I think Joe Biden could have done better and should have done better in terms of kind of charting this this centrist path of unity that he promised as the candidate.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So maybe one final question before we wrap up. So now that, you've established in the lecture that Biden has perhaps shifted far too left and alienated moderate voters. So now that he's announced re-election, do you think that it would benefit him to continue embracing these more progressive policies and a more progressive approach to win re-election? Or would it serve him better to kind of shift the rhetoric?
Well, I think to an extent, all presidential candidates tend to tack more toward the center in a general election. And of course, the fact that Joe Biden isn't going to face a serious primary challenger, at least it looks like that at this point, means that he doesn't have to pivot left. And so I do expect him to take more of a centrist approach in the 2024 election. I also expect his campaign just to be relatively low key. I think over the next several months, we're just going to see such a battle on the Republican side, Donald Trump versus Ron DeSantis and any other candidates who have already declared or may potentially declared. I think he just wants to let those candidates kind of beat themselves up as much as possible. And for him to kind of essentially take the high road, stay out of the limelight to an extent, and then prep for the 2024 general. I think that that's really where you can expect Biden to go. Okay.
We have an extra question. So do you think if China escalates, I don't know if you want to, if China escalates tensions with Taiwan further, that would be a boom to either Trump or Biden in 24?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That would certainly inject a lot of uncertainty into 2024. And I'm not sure it's obvious that it would benefit one candidate over the other. Certainly the Russia's war in Ukraine has also injected a lot of uncertainty. I think by and large that has helped Joe Biden. Biden has to this point said essentially that he would be prepared to respond militarily should China decide to invade Taiwan. Some within the White House have backtracked a little bit and said that this official policy of what's referred to as strategic ambiguity is still on the table. But yeah, I really hesitate to predict one way or the other whether that would help Joe Biden more, whether that would help Donald Trump more. But that's the kind of thing, that kind of X factor, that unpredictability that we just can't know in advance, but could have a fairly significant effect on the next election.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I think we can wrap up maybe. So thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all here today. And thank you to our speaker, Thomas, for his insightful presentation. Thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. And also, as we come to the end of today's event, I'd like to remind you all of the upcoming lunch hour lecture on May 2nd. The topic of the lecture is, do we live in more anxious times, and are we equipped to deal with them? And yeah, once again, thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.